Okay, we're back for this little shorter version. Anyway, I just wanted to spend a little more time talking about the social distance scale because I've had some experience with this scale in the past. But the social distance scale it's one of the cultural dimensions of prejudice, and it's based on a hypothesis that people the less that people have uh, interaction with certain groups, that is, on a daily basis, they have very little contact socially, personally, with people from a certain group. The less the contact, the more prejudice. The less the more social distant. They don't really want much to do with that group. Let's see here. Further evidence for the cultural nature of prejudice provided by research on the concept of social distance, which is related to prejudice but is not quite the same. Social distance is the degree of intimacy that a person is willing to accept in his or her relations with members of other groups. Intimacy. So it could be anywhere from allowing them into your country to marriage. Uh, so social distance is the degree of intimacy a person is willing to accept in his or her relations with members of other groups. On this scale, the most intimate relationship is close kinship. Uh, and the most distant is exclusion from the country altogether. And then the 7 degrees of social distance, as specified by Emery Bogartis, the inventor of the scale, are as follows. Number one, to close kinship by marriage, you're willing to go that far with a member of that group. To my club as a personal chums, can be in my club, our little peer groups. To my street as a neighbor, to allow that person, number 4, to employment in my occupation. 5, you see how it's getting more distance. To citizenship in my country. 6, as visitors only to my country. Now we're really getting there, right? These folks can only visit. And then the furthest out would exclude from my country altogether. Research using social distance scales demonstrates that Americans rank other groups in similar ways across time and space. And so it shows a consistency over the years. And just in fine, because you can certainly read this, that it's been pretty consistent that white European Americans and other white European groups have always been consistently on the top. The English, and then the American whites, Canadians, Irish, Germans, Norwegians they always get the best scores in terms of intimacy. And this is looking from 1926 to 2001. Then you go down, it's changed for some groups. So for some, it's remained the same. And then what's interesting to think about these changes is think about things that have gone on. For example, it was really low back in the 20s, and it kind of went up some. 20, it was some, you look at the Russians, for example, look at the Italians. You can see where they've been up and then they've gone down. You have to ask yourself why that is. But it still tends to remain consistent. If you get down here to, I'm trying to find, for example, let's take the African American case. If you look, it was pretty low in the 20s, all the way through the 40s, even the 50s, in terms of their rank. But by the time you get to 1977, you notice that it is much better, at 17th rank. And by 2001, 9th rank. So, what can we say? What can we think about the changes historically about people's perceptions of African Americans is that what I would consider to be the big differences in 1966, you had the Civil Rights Movement all through the decade, and you had the success of the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that's why we start seeing in the culture a more open, more informed about African Americans began to be integrated into the society, and as African Americans have become more integrated, uh, it seems borne out. It seems to borne out that civil rights movement on certain levels was very successful in changing people's perceptions. Now, certainly that's not across the board, but we just see overall aggregate data that African Americans have improved their station in terms of the social distance scale. And but you go on down, um, and the data we've had over time. Every time I've ever seen the social distance scales, it was the Middle Easterners that were always on the very bottom. Arabs tended to be very low in the worst station. Uh, and so they've remained there. And we could ask ourselves with all the events, of the war and the first Gulf War, 9/11, second Iraq War, and then all the other tensions we've seen, why the Arabs have not improved their station. So why could that be? Well, it could be we've never had a real positive social movement like African Americans, for example, in the society to try to remedy the prejudicial feelings towards Arabs. And so without a positive social movement to remedy the issues, maybe perhaps that's maybe not the only cause, but one of the causal factors that has kept the Arabs at the bottom. Some students will rationalize. They'll say, "Well, that's done intentionally because we may have wars in the future." And I can't claim. No studies have shown that, but we do know that there's this ongoing tendency of there being a social distance towards Arabs, and it could be again, unlike the African Americans with a successful social movement such as the Civil Rights Movement, has not played a big part. Has not changed their situation very much. We see the same thing. The American Indians also had a social movement, the Red Movement in the '60s and '70s, influenced by the Civil Rights Movement. It's had a more positive impact for Native Americans in terms of the social distance scale, anyway. But you can study these and then try to think about where you see changes, why those changes came about. A lot of times it has to do with changes in the environment, cultural environment perceptions, changes in the economy at the time, these kinds of things. I'm just looking here. Okay. Yeah. So just to understand that, but my experience with social distance scale was when I was teaching in Michigan at Central Michigan University, where I got 2 of my degrees, but I also taught there while I was writing my dissertation. I taught there for about 5 years. And one thing we did in the methods class was that my students and we put together the scale as it is, and then we wanted to, we did a sample from the college students there at Central Michigan University. And so we added, just to play with the logic of the hypothesis a little bit, we added two groups. So one group we added was the hippies from the 1960s, which kind of came and went. Excuse me. And kind of came and went. And then we also added a group that was fictitious altogether. We called it called the group the perennials. Of course, from our gardeners here in the class, perennials flower. But we put the perennials in there nonetheless because part of the hypothesis should be borne out that groups you've never heard of, haven't had any contact with, your distance should be way more stark than groups that you've had a lot more contact with and know more about, right? So we put those 2 in there as sort of control variables. And then we did our sample and got our data back and placed it and put it in the SPSS program. And we ran some tabs, and the results were pretty much came out the way we see it here. Generally, the white Americans, white Europeans, white Canadians tended to be. They tended to have the better situation in terms of social distance. People were most willing to be intimate. Marry into their families. And then It kind of keeps the same sort of scale. Arabs being at the bottom, except except that yes, Arabs were on the bottom, but right just above them was the hippies, the hippie generation. Because this was this was in the 90s, well after the hippie my generation had moved on. So they didn't have a lot of information about the hippies. Maybe had heard of them on TV or whatnot, but no real experience. So they didn't want to be intimate that much with the hippies. And then on the worst, even worse than the Arab category near the bottom there, at the bottom there was the perennials. The perennials were the worst. They were in the worst situation in terms of social distance. Students felt very, almost none reported any, wanted to have any intimate relationships with the perennials. So that kind of helped to give a little bit more credence to the hypothesis about social distance and by using the perennials. I thought that was kind of humorous, but also helps to support the hypothesis, and so it was borne out. But I think one of my critiques of the social distance scale is that I think it does. I think there's a bias to some degree, because it can't explain all forms of discrimination. I think it's context dependent. It's one dimension of, if you will, of prejudicial feelings and perceptions. For example, I think it's more biased towards the northern cities, for example, where groups have experienced de facto segregation, where they just grew up in different neighborhoods, and they didn't have school busing, like in many of your Midwestern cities. So when I was teaching in Detroit, for example, I had a lot of students from various ethnic communities that had never had interactions with other ethnic groups that were in the classroom. So, I had African American students, white students, and I had other ethnic students who grew up in their own communities, went to school in their own communities, and had very little social contact with each other in terms of their personal relationships with other groups of people. So the more distant they are from each other, the more prejudicial feelings they have, the more they feel socially distant from. So it relates to prejudice. It's not so much prejudice, but it does relate to it. And I found this to be interesting in that it tends to have that bias. For example, in the southern United States, where between, for example, African Americans and white Southerners, in cities, but also certainly out in the rural areas and rural communities, under the segregation laws, you still had a lot of interaction going on. A lot of you had one of the main occupations for African American women was in the homes of white families, as taking care of the children in the home during the day. A lot of times when the parents or the white mother was out working somewhere. Many of us had this situation, and so you had this close interaction going on. People working together, sometimes officially, sometimes informally. In smaller communities, people knew each other. And while there were segregation laws, still there was on a daily basis there was a lot more interaction than say in those big de facto segregated city like Chicago or Detroit. But then again, you had some of the worst prejudice in the country concentrated in these areas because of the history of blatant discrimination and ideological racism. It's quite rampant, especially in the very much so during the segregation years. So, but the social distance scale really does not satisfy me in terms of that context. The prejudice was based in that more so in that social inequality. In that history of stark inequality and having forced minority groups, if you take into if you also consider Native Americans who were also segregated in the South. I don't think the social distance scale does that a lot of justice. But I do think it's biased towards, when I say biased, means it tends to, I think it really favors more the de facto, not the not the segregation that's based in de jure segregation in a lot of legal codes, right? But de facto segregation of the northern cities. I think that the social distance scale gets at that sense of prejudice or feeling much better than it does in terms of the South. But anyway, that's one dimension, one aspect of that methodology, if you will, and hypothesis to ponder those differences. To what extent is this? To what extent is it generalizable to all the populations in the United States? And I think it's limited in that respect. I think it's. I really think it's got regional bias in it. But interesting nonetheless, and does explain some aspects of prejudice. Uh, so anyway, I just wanted to touch base a little bit with that section, and if you got any questions about any of the concepts, theories, shoot me an email. I'm more than willing to help clarify any concepts, any of the concepts or questions about the theories or their relationship even. All you got to do is email me, and I'll do my best to answer that for you. We'll take the test on. I'll open it on late Sunday evening, about 11 o'clock, and then it'll be open all the way till Tuesday. And I'm going to make that exam an open format so that you'll get the exam all at once instead of one question at a time, and you'll have the ability to. I guess you have the ability to go forward and backwards. Just see the exam in its totality, and though I do randomize the questions, however. So. Anyway, I'm not going to give you any more assignments through the weekend because you're needing to study for your exam. Again, email me with any questions, and we'll be back with each other. I'll certainly shoot you an email before or at the time that I open the exam. And what I'm going to do this weekend is spend some time on your posts up to date and go and check those posts and see some of your comments. All right, everybody have a good weekend and study hardy. All right, bye-bye.